Good evening, all. The 1960s was a boom time for nautical endeavour and exploration. In 1960, Auguste Piccard in the Bathyscaphe Trieste managed to descend all the way down into the Marianas Trench. In 1963, Jacques Cousteau and his team built habitat under the sea, in the Red Sea area, and where they could live underwater for weeks at a time and observe marine life. In 1966, John Ridgway and Che Blythe rowed all the way across the Atlantic, and in 1967, Francis Chichester performed the first solo circumnavigation of the globe in a yacht. So Chichester's achievement was remarkable, and he was greeted with a lot of adulation and large crowds on his return. Hundreds of boats escorted the Gypsy Moth 4 into port, and when he was knighted that same year, there were thousands upon thousands of people turned out to see it. It was a big media event. So a lot of mariners in the world at that time, seeing that if you did something remarkable at sea, you could become a celebrity. So a number of mariners and yachtsmen were thinking, well, what's going to be the next big thing? So whilst Chichester's achievement was fantastic, he did touch port a few times for victualling and repairs. So people started thinking, what if you could sail around the world in a yacht, single-handed, but non-stop, never touching port? And so that was the plan was put into operation in 1968, not by one person, but by a number of people who had the same idea. Well, the media got wind of this and decided to organise a competition. The Sunday Times newspaper organised something called the Golden Globe, and it was a competition to see who could perform this feat. There were two prizes on offer. The first one was a trophy for the person who completed the voyage first. The second was a cash prize, and that went to the person who did it in the quickest time. All in all, 9 men would enter this competition, but only one would complete it successfully. That man is called Robin Knox-Johnston, and to him both prizes went. Of the remaining 8 competitors, a number of them dropped out because their ships became damaged on the journey, especially going around the Cape of Good Hope. They were hit by strong, heavy seas, and their boats took far too much damage to carry on, so they had to go into port and they were disqualified. Then another 2 attempted the voyage, but the stress and the strain of sailing solo around the world in such terrible conditions, with their boats taking damage, where they couldn't get to sleep at night because they were worried about the damage that their boats had taken and whether they would even survive the night. So they pulled out before getting to the Cape of Good Hope. Another yachtsman sank within sight of victory. Certainly not first man around the world, but certainly the cash prize. He was within sight of victory. He was able to be rescued. And then there was a Frenchman, Bernard Moitessier, who decided he wasn't going to compete. He had almost made it all the way home. He would have won the prize, but he decided that he was sailing purely for the love of sailing solo. So he abandoned the race and decided to sail another half circumference around the world, ended up in Tahiti some months later when he just got fed up. But then there was one other competitor, a man called Donald Crowhurst, who died on the voyage. And it's his story that has captured the media's attention over the last 50 years. And why is this so? Well, I was going to tell you that his story has been told many times. For this talk, I'm going to be drawing primarily from 2 sources. One is a book called The Strange Last Voyage of Donald Crowhurst by Tomlin and Hall, and the second is from Chris Bonington's excellent book, Quest for Adventure, where he devotes a large chapter to the exploits. It's a good summary of the Golden Globe contest and about all the people that competed in it, not just Crowhurst. So why have the media gone after this one competitor and not, say, Robin Knox-Johnston? to the same effect. Although I think it's interesting to compare and contrast all the 9 competitors and the attitudes and they took, the preparations they took, and what happened to each one of them on the voyage. But certainly Crowhurst has grabbed the attention. Now, apart from so many books written on the subject, there's been magazine, newspaper articles written about him. There have been stage plays about him. Sorry, get out, cat. Ship's cat. There have been stage plays written about Crowhurst, and there have been no fewer than 5 films. There's a very good documentary film called Deep Water, made in 2006. Even though it contains some factual errors, I think it's a good documentary if you want to know more about the race and Crowhurst's life and death. But there have been 5 feature films, fictional feature films. Made on it, 2 in the last 12 months. One of them made in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. So what's the enduring appeal of this? Or what's the morbid fascination? Well, let's go a bit into Crowhurst's background. Well, Crowhurst was born in India to British parents, but they had to leave after independence, and his father lost all his money when he had to abandon his business ventures out there. And he died when Crowhurst was young. His mother had a kind of strange way of bringing him up. He left school early, became an apprentice at the Farnborough Aerospace Engineering Factory, and that paved the way for him getting a commission in the RAF, which he had to leave before his term of service was up, due to some scandal. It's kind of not understood what that scandal was, but there was a scandal. He had to leave. He transferred into the army. There was more scandals, and he had to be dishonorably discharged again. He went into private business after that, making electrical equipment for yachts and sailing ships. It wasn't a particularly successful business. He had great ideas, but apparently, by all accounts, he wasn't very good at pushing projects through. He didn't have that kind of drive that a lot of successful people need. He came up with very good ideas, and he was skilled as an electrical engineer, but he lacked the ability to see projects through, or do things in an efficient, organised way to make a successful business. However, he was very dismissive of Chichester's achievement in 1967. He refused to watch on television the knighthood and the victory celebrations, claiming that the real challenge would be to sail solo without touching port. So he was one of these people that independently had the idea to do this challenge. So what happened next was that when he heard about the contest, he entered it, and he had his own very particular ideas about how it would be done. Instead of purchasing a boat, like a lot of the other competitors, either used their own boats or purchased a stock boat for the voyage, he decided he would have one created from scratch to his own design. It would be a trimaran, that's a yacht that has 3 hulls. The central one is the one where you steer from and you live in, and the other 2 are for supplies and buoyancy, ballast, that kind of thing. So he had this boat constructed from scratch, and he was going to fill it with all these electronic gadgets that nobody else would have, and then he would enter the race. The rules of the race were that you could leave between the 1st of June 1968 and the latest you could depart was the 31st of October of the same year. He was going to be one of the ones that went late because he entered the contest late. Even though he had the idea, he claimed back in '67, he took a long time to actually push through on his project, and he was subject to delays. The yacht itself, its building had delays, and they kind of rushed it towards the end. At that stage, he needed to raise a lot of money. So he went to his business partner, who was a very kind of dour, hard-nosed businessman who he wasn't a sentimental man. He said, "Well, if you're going to do this, right, and I'm going to give you money, I need some return. So if you don't make a good show of it, if you don't, expect you to at least finish." Crowhurst was saying he was going to win, but his business partner said, "Okay, if you've got to finish, or at least, get most of the way around. Otherwise, you have to fork out money for the yacht, which is about £5,000." So Crowhurst took him up on this. Then he fell in with a publicist, kind of guy who used to work in newspapers, who really did hype up Crowhurst as the underdog. That he had the radical design, he had all the radical ideas, so he was going to win. This underdog was going to take on the experienced, and more better known sailors in this contest. So what happened was that Crowhurst's yacht was nowhere near ready. October the 31st was looming. He was beset with delays. So when he finally did depart on the 31st of October 1968, the yacht was Tamoth Electron, it was called, just was nowhere near ready. The electronics weren't finished. It hadn't had proper sea trials or anything, but he set off anyway. He was conflicted about whether or not he should go, but other people saying, "Come on, we've come this far, go for it." So the pressure was on, financially and in terms of saving face for him to go. He made very slow going of it coming down the Atlantic. I think his lack of experience was telling against him. The design was very new of the Tamoth Electron was very new, and it was slow going. And when he started hitting the South Atlantic, he was getting into the rougher weather, and it was pounding the boat, and leaks started appearing. So by the time he was approaching the Cape of Good Hope, he didn't think that his vessel could make it all the way around. He didn't think it could make it around the Cape of Good Hope. He rated his chances of survival at 50-50. Now, something happens at this point. He knows if he gives up and doesn't make a good show of it, he stands to lose a lot of money, perhaps even go bankrupt. He's been hyped up by this press agent. The BBC showed up and they put a lot of emphasis on his entry into the race. I mean, there was a lot of press attention for all the competitors, but he had a lot on him. He talked the talk, you see, that's the thing. He built up his own endeavour with it, and the press fed off it. And so by the time he got to the Cape of Good Hope, he decided that he was going to cheat, that there was no way he could get the Tamoth Electron all the way around the world and successfully navigate through the Southern Ocean. So his plan was just to amble around for months on his own in the Atlantic Ocean, just sort of bimble around. He would switch his radio offs for long periods of the time and claim that his radio wasn't working. And he would do something very complicated. He would when he did make reports and write in his logbook, he would write fake log entries calculating his position. Now, cheating your position is a lot more difficult than you would think it is. He would have to almost reverse engineer where he actually was, and if he was going to point on a map and say, "Okay, that's where I am at this time," he had to do amazing mental mathematical calculations to actually fake his logbooks. So what this did was months of sailing around the world, worried about becoming bankrupt, without shutting himself off from company, cheating, putting out a lie, doing these reverse calculations. And he had tape recorders and film cameras, and he would tape himself doing talks on how his progress is going and filming himself with a cine camera. And he was putting on this, I'm doing fantastically well, I'm going fast. He actually at one stage said he was going at a record speeds for a yacht, that he'd broken a speed record. I mean, that's the level of the embellishment he was doing. And after months of doing this, he starts going mad. And what happens is that in his log, he had kept 4 logbooks. These genuine one where the genuine position was, the fake logbook, one which I think had radio messages in it, and one was like a personal journal. And his personal journal becomes bizarre as it starts off with writing poems about him being a misfit, and it ends up as a 25,000 word document where he starts reimagining Einstein's general theory of relativity and linking it to outer body experiences. And then towards the end, um, he's just losing more and more touch with reality as he cannot hold the lie, the truth, and his own dreamlike state in balance, and he starts losing his mind. And there are times when he could have quit the race and save face. There's one bit where he faked, oh yes, I've just come round Cape Horn and I'm on the final stretch. He could have, he did actually dock in Argentina, in a remote place, and he could have just said, right, I was 3/4 of the way around the world, the boat can't handle it, I'm quitting, and he would have got away with it. But no, he touched land, made a few repairs, then went out to sea again. And then what happens is that in the last few hundred miles before he makes it back, he realizes that the world is going to inspect his logbooks and see that something's wrong, and dispute his claims of where he was, and that the game would be up. And so one day he decides to take the fake logbook and jump off the boat. And that's the end. He committed suicide. And as I said, his story has this fascination with people, and particularly people on the left. Now, I mentioned this Soviet film earlier, and I've mentioned some of the books. Paul Foot, a very left-wing journalist, wrote a harsh critique of capitalism and the media in the wake of Crowhurst's death. And the Soviet film picks up the same theme, that Crowhurst is a victim of capitalism. It was capitalism, it was ruthless businessmen that held him to ransom, that he had to compete, in order to win money and glory for them, and the unscrupulous press agents pushing Crowhurst forward for fame, so that he's not, they're doing it for their own ruthless money grabbing ways. And the whole Western media circus and the quest for money and riches, and Crowhurst is a victim. There's the victim narrative here being played out, that he is left alone. He would have been Rousseau's perfect natural state, but it was capitalism that ruined his father. It was capitalism that made him try and compete and struggle in his business. It was capitalism that led to his death. Now, I have some issues with that, and the fact that at every stage of I've looked at Crowhurst's life, and at lots of stages he could have said no. One simple way out: he's got a failing business, but he's got a good product. He could have donated his proto GPS systems that he had, this location device that apparently worked quite well, but it needed development. He could have donated that to some of the competitors and just said, I'm sponsoring you. He could have become the sponsor. He didn't have to sit on board a boat. There's something in his character, and this is that, did capitalism kill Donald Crowhurst, or was there something lacking in his character? With all due deference to his family, who are still very much alive, but there's something about there's something that Bonington touches on, and in the the Tomalin and Hall book touches on, is that this need to be need for attention that Crowhurst had, this need for validation within himself. And he could have made choices. If his business partner had made too unreasonable a request, he could have said no. He didn't have to get on board that boat to make the voyage. When the press agent was saying that he had to depart from a certain town, he had to depart from Teignmouth rather than from his original departure point because of the publicity, he could have said no. He could have dismissed that press agent. There could have been ways Crowhurst could have done things. In a free capitalist liberal society, you have the power to say no to things that are unreasonable. And getting sucked in it's like a test of character. Under a socialist system, would Crowhurst have survived? Well, there probably wouldn't have been a race if we had a socialist system, because yachting is a pastime of the privileged, and who and it doesn't bring any benefits to society. You know, there are benefits to pushing yourself and doing these great endeavors and feats. They are quite inspiring. They show limits of human ability, and they also do end up leading on to improvements in, say, ship design in this case, and yachting, sort of improvements. But in a socialist society or communist society, they wouldn't have done this. But it's very rich for the left to claim this about Crowhurst, and that capitalism led to his undoing, because whilst in the West, certainly nautical endeavour was being looked at, but in communist society, they were looking to space. And you have a similar situation in the Soviet Union, in the space race, because the Soviet Union pushed people into dangerous situations just because of the bringing glory to the Soviet system. So I'm thinking here of the two Voskhod programs. The Vostok program was very successful. Voskhod was very slipshod. To beat the Americans at putting 3 men into space. So they cut all the safety protocols out, sent 3 men into a cramped spaceship in nothing but tracksuits. The mission could have failed easily. They got lucky. They got lucky again with Voskhod 2, Alexei Leonov spacewalk. It was done primarily, the spacewalk was done primarily to put one up over the Americans who were planning a similar thing. But again, the corners they cut, the risks they took, and it all came crashing down in 1967 with Soyuz 1, a craft they knew wouldn't be able to stand the rigors of spaceflight. But they put a man in it, Vladimir Komarov. They sent him up there. And Komarov probably knew that he was a dead man on that mission, but the pressure that he was put under to go on that mission. And that apparently he was railing against the authorities from space, knowing that his capsule wasn't working, nothing was working, and they brought him back early, and the parachutes failed on it, and he went to his death. So it's very rich to say that under a socialist system, a man wouldn't be pushed into that life or death situation for out of sheer glory and prestige, when the Soviets were doing precisely that with their own cosmonauts' lives. And the second thing, this is why I think this idea that capitalism was the undoing of Donald Crowhurst is why there's so much media attention here. There's so many books, stage plays, 5 feature films. Yes, we are fascinating. The story about how he came to make the decision to fake his voyage, and the kind of loneliness, the existential angst, and the mental disintegration, I think has a morbid fascination about it. But I think this is, even kind of the soft, progressive, media liberal left. I still keep coming back to this story. Why have we got 2 films on the same subject in the same year, on this about this man? And I think the Golden Globe race is so fascinating, and all 9 of those competitors are fascinating, and yet we're focusing on the one who tragically failed. There were other tragedies. One of the other competitors committed suicide 3 years later. And you can link that to the Golden Globe race, because that man, Nigel Tetley, he was in a very similar design of craft to Crowhurst, but his craft was better built. And he was within sight of winning the prize for the fastest around the world. And when he heard that Crowhurst was allegedly very close to beating him, he pushed his yacht too fast and too hard, and the yacht ended up sinking. Tetley was rescued, but he committed suicide 3 years later. And maybe there's the connection has been made that Crowhurst's dishonesty led to Tetley's sinking. And so there's repercussions from that, and it's all framed around this, that the race was immoral. When you look at if such ventures again, and next year, or maybe even later this year, I can't remember, but they're going to recreate the race. They are actually going to have a second Golden Globe solo non-stop round the world challenge. But you can bet this time there's going to be so much sponsorship. It's going to be big teams. It's not going to be privateers and romantics competing in this race. It's going to be hardcore, state-of-the-art, extremely well-funded this time. So, no, it's not capitalism that killed Donald Crowhurst. It is the choices he made. It's his own test of character, where Robin Knox-Johnston succeeded through his will, determination, and actually applying himself. It's the poor choices, disastrous choices that Crowhurst made, but ultimately he is responsible, or he was responsible for those choices, and not an economic system. And on that note, that is the end of my sea story. Good night.